Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and today's video is a little bit different from the usual affair. I've been greatly enjoying Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, which is the newest Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game from Cubicle 7. They've been doing a pretty phenomenal job with it. I have literally every single book. I do not get them for free. I buy them with my own money. I have a fair number of the collector's editions. I am a very big fan of the game, and I try my hardest to support it, and I love playing it. I play in a campaign as a player. I GM a campaign, and I'm hoping to GM a lot more in the coming future. But in light of that, and because of what this video is mainly about, I wanted to start focusing some attention on reviewing their books, talking about elements of their books, working my way through the frankly staggering number of releases and covering the pros and cons of my perspective. However, there are two books that, rather than kind of doing a standard review, I kind of want to do more of a what can I can almost describe as sending out an emergency ping of these books are great. They're good. They're good books that should be great, but they have some issues. The main two that I'm talking about being the Dwarf Player's Guide and the High Elf Player's Guide. The main reason for this is while there are so many things, genuinely so many things to love about these books, some of which I'm going to talk about and point out, there are some deep, glaring issues that I would strongly encourage Cubicle 7 to fix before they push out the physical publications of these books, if at all possible. Because when they first release the books, you can early order them, get them in early access, and you'll basically receive a PDF copy of the book that gets updates, because there's always little things wrong, like there'll be grammatical errors or spelling issues, or there will be like rules that don't make sense, or they reference something that they forgot to include, like stuff happens. And so they will update the PDF versions to fix various issues as the books get closer to the physical release. So it is my personal, very deep hope that this video can serve as a flare about some major issues in these books that can be resolved before they go out to physical print. Now, in the olden days, back in like the early 2000s, the 1990s, etc., if a book of any kind released with major flaws, it was just kind of an unfortunate situation you just had to deal with, and there was no real way around it. But now, with the ease of communication, access to the internet, there are bullet points these are bullets rather that we can avoid. There are ways that these can be fixed, and because we have access to so much more at the snap of a finger, we can do the research we need to do and find problems and hopefully find out why they're problems and then how to solve them in relatively quick order. So today I am going to discuss the Dwarf Player's Guide with a focus on the issues that I hope can be resolved. And I will say, even if it's too late for the print version, which it might be, I still think these issues would be worth solving, at least for future PDF versions or maybe later editions of the print. So if like the first edition print of the Dwarf Player's Handbook has these issues and it's impossible to fix them because they're already printed, that's life, that's fine. But I hope that this can maybe be fixed for the second edition print, or at least just the PDF version. So, I do want to note, these are great books. I am not coming on here to say these are garbage books or that they are trash books. I encourage you to get these books to support the writing that Cubicle 7 is doing. I think they're doing a lot of great things. I think occasionally they get some weird oopsies, which we're going to talk about here today. And these aren't the only books where I've seen that. A lot of the prior books have little issues that come up from time to time. I've caught some of them. Some of them have been rectified because I was able to catch them, and I did a live stream or a video where I talked about it, and somebody at Cubicle 7 saw it and was like, oh, we can fix that, and they did before the books went to print. So I'm hoping this maybe can replicate the situation. But I'm going to include links down below in the pinned comment about where you can purchase these books, because I do genuinely think they're worth the price and are super, super, super duper, duper, duper great books, even if they have some issues, which will hopefully be resolved. So the first thing I want to discuss is the rather unique circumstance behind this video's book, because we're only going to talk about the Dwarf Player's Guide in this one. This book was, to my understanding, rather heavily headlined by Alfred Nunez, which is actually pretty awesome, as Alfred wrote the original Dwarf roleplay book for Warhammer Fantasy, which was known as Dwarf's Stone and Steel, back in 2002, which was essentially around like 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy, which was very different from what would kind of come later. Well, granted, 5th edition is recognizable to kind of like modern Warhammer fans, but there were some fairly significant evolutions, you know, going into 6 and beyond. This book, the Dwarf Stone and Steel book, back in 2002, put into the world a ton of ideas that would evolve into the dwarfs that we have today. So calling upon Alfred to return 22 years later was an excellent decision. Now, even though I think it was the right decision to bring him back and to be like a significant contributor on this, it does come with an issue, which is that I feel, reading through the book, that there was not a good enough effort made to double check everything that was put into the book, to watch out for potential issues. There doesn't seem to have been much editing oversight to ensure that all the bits that were written fit nicely with more modern lore and with the lore that Games Workshop is publishing right now for the old world. There are significant, huge issues that should have been caught. While the book is a very good size, 144 pages, there's really no excuse for these to have gotten past, hopefully, multiple layers of editing. And either someone who just didn't know anything about the dwarfs was checking this information and completely missed this stuff. Or I don't know. But we'll talk about that as we get into the specific ones. So, the book does have some rather notable errors in the lore that conflict not only with the modern-ish canon of like 8th edition back to like 6th edition dwarfs, but also contradict the new modern updated lore in the old world from the core rulebook and from the Dwarf Arcane Journal. So this isn't a situation of me just being like a 6th to 8th edition purist and these were the best editions. It's not about that. It's about that there is a modern version of the story between the 8th edition and the old world, and this book kind of flies in the face of that several times. If you go back and read the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf Stone and Steel book, which I recommend, it's a great book, and you go look at the new 4th edition book, you'll see there's actually a number of sections that are just directly copy-pasted, which is kind of weird. Sometimes it's totally fine. There are stories that, even though they're literally just copy-pasted, they stand out because the tone is kind of weird and the stories feel very bizarre when compared against like more modern understandings of the lore. But it's like, okay, whatever. It would have been nice for someone to kind of go over them with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that those stories felt like they were appropriately through the lens of modern Warhammer. But that's not a huge deal, and I don't really care about that. The things that should be fixed are some things I'm going to talk about here in just a moment, because I'd really like for this book to avoid the rather annoying classic Warhammer Fantasy problem of newer printed lore making really ridiculous, silly mistakes and introducing very unnecessary conflicts and confusion for new fans who get these books. It shouldn't be that hard nowadays, with how easy you can get access to literally everything that's ever been printed, to just double check like 1 to 3 books worth of stuff and just, make sure you're all golden. I will note that I have personally submitted all these issues to Cubicle 7 through their provided appropriate submission channels, but unfortunately, the 2 updates that have been made to the Dwarf Player's Guide have only included grammatical and spelling fixes, which I also submitted all of that I could find, but they didn't resolve any of the major lore flaws. So I felt that I should make a video about it, something that is a little bit more attention grabbing. Though I will note that for this video, I am not going to focus on any grammatical or spelling errors because they're catching most of those. But I also think that anyone that's reading through the book could very easily go, oh, that's a spelling error, or, oh, that's a grammar error, and just like move on. With all that said, let's dive in. So our first issue crops up in the sidebar passage under page 10, which I'll put on screen so you can read it, which talks, it's under the sidebar called Sigmar, Kurgan, and the Alliance of Honor. This is a fun little passage that includes a brief telling of the first meeting between Sigmar of the Unburigan tribe and High King Kurgan Ironbeard of the Dwarves. The issue is that in the second sentence, it claims that Kurgan was leading a hunting party south of Karaz Ankor, where he would be ambushed and captured by orcs, but this doesn't make any sense. South of Karaz Ankor, which, to be clear, Karaz Ankor means the Dwarfen realms. So this is all of the Dwarf holds and a significant chunk of the World's Edge Mountains. South of the Karaz Ankor would imply somewhere very, very far south. At absolute minimum, if you want to be super generous, you could say, oh, maybe like the Border Princes, because that's south of Karaz-Akarak, but that's not what Karaz Ankor means. If you're taking the literal definition, that would be insinuating that High King Kurgan was captured and then rescued by Sigmar way down south, like south of Karak Azul, practically in the like armpit of the Southlands, which is ridiculous because Sigmar never went that far south, never even close to that far south, ever. None of those locations were visited by Sigmar, at least in his younger years. I don't think you could make an argument that he ever visited those locations. And the Unburgans lived a fair bit west of the Karaz Ankor in modern-day Reichland, but not south. In the older lore about this exact event, all of it agrees that King Kurgan was captured on his way to the Grey Mountains, if it specifies where. A lot of it just says like, oh, he was captured and Sigmar saved him, and they don't really worry about where exactly. But there are some sources that full on say, oh yeah, he was on his way to the Grey Mountains and got captured by Greenskins, which would make complete sense because the Grey Mountains are right next to Reichland. So if he was captured there, Sigmar and his tribe would have been right next to them, which is exactly how that would have gone down. But that's still west, not south. I mean, you could even make a really extreme argument if you wanted to that maybe Sigmar was like venturing super far away from his home and was like in modern day Sylvania. So they were really close to Karaz-Akarak on kind of that on near where like Zufbar is. And maybe that's where the High King was captured. And Sigmar was like tracking a group of orcs and came across them and saved the High King. But that's a pretty big stretch in my opinion. And that's still west of the Karaz Ankor. So this one is a super easy fix. Someone literally just needs to go onto page 10, go to that second sentence, and change the word south to the word west. That's it. That's all you gotta do. Super easy fix. Unless they're gonna completely rewrite Sigmar's story and say that he went on an epic journey through Blackfire Pass, across what we understand now as the Border Princes, down through the Badlands, until he gets like to roughly the Marshes of Madness, if not a little further down, and then heads east until he gets into the mountains near Karak Azul, and that's where he ran into and saved the High King, which is ridiculous. All right, so the next one is the biggie. And this one's a triple threat and is my personal biggest gripe and disappointment with this book. This section is massively just wrong and completely screws up some what I would consider really critical story beats to the modern Dawi, which needs to be fixed. On page 13, under the Alliance Reborn subchapter or section, in the right-hand column, actually no, sorry, left-hand column, we get some text about High King Balin Alricsson, dealing with the rise of Azavar Kul and the Great War against Chaos. According to the Dwarf's Player's Guide, High King Alricsson decides to focus his efforts on defending the Dwarf realms from greenskins and sends his son, Prince Thorgrim Grudgebearer, with an army of 1,000 dwarfs to help defend Kislev city. This is followed up by a brief scene where Thorgrim is so impressed with Magnus the Pious, the human leading the armies of the Empire and who ultimately breaks the siege, that he bows before the manling and in his father's name re-swears the oath of Kurgan Ironbeard to renew the alliance between their peoples. Hooray. So, what's the problem here? Well, there's a couple of really big ones. The first major one, and this is an undeniable problem, is that Thorgrim Grudgebearer isn't High King Alricsson's son. Thorgrim is his nephew. Thorgrim has always been his nephew in all of the old lore. And in the new lore, the Dwarf Arcane Journal, he is still Alricsson's nephew. He has never ever been and will never be High King Alricsson's son. He is his nephew. The son or sons of High King Alricsson end up dying in the lore that talks about them at the Battle of the Gates of Kislev. Though this isn't like super set in stone, you could have them die at the battle, you could have them die to greenskin attacks or whatever. But that's why in the new Arcane Journal, he's Thorgrim Ulison of Clan Ulik, not Thorgrim Alexson. Son, because it'd be High King. Well, actually, no, he'd be Thorgrim Balin's son, actually, but that's not what his name is. Thorgrim, it literally says in the Arcane Journal that Thorgrim's father's name is Uli, so he's Ulison. Though I will admit, very annoyingly, the Arcane Journal also has an error because it calls Thorgrim Ulickson, but his father's name is Uli, so it should be Ulison. He's from Clan Ulik, but that's not how that works. You're not the son of the clan, you're the son of your dad. That's why High King Alricsson is the son of Alric, which is how every dwarf that has ever had a son or daughter name has ever worked ever in the entirety of the lore. I don't know how someone at GW didn't catch that it's supposed to be Thorgrim Ulison, not Thorgrim Ulickson, but whatever, we're not here to talk about that. So, but in that passage, which I'll also include on screen, Thorgrim's father is Uli, and his mother is Kemma Alric's daughter, who is the sister of High King Balin Alric's son. So you had High King Alric, who had at least two children. He had his son, Balin, and his daughter, Kemma. And his son, Balin, becomes the High King, and his daughter, Kemma, goes on to have a son with Uli, who is Thorgrim. So that's a gigantic issue that needs to be fixed. And this book even doubles down on it. So it's not like it was an error that like someone accidentally misprinted a word in the wrong spot. Whoever wrote this book genuinely made that mistake and just doubles down. Because if you go to the timeline section on what page is that? 15. If you go to the part about the Great War, it talks about Prince Thorgrim using his father's name to renew the oath of honor, which is unnecessary, I think, and weird. So anyway, that's issue 1. Next, we have the issue of High King Alricsson not going to fight at the Battle of the Gates of Kislev. In every version of the Battle of the Gates of Kislev that I could find, and I went back to the first edition WFRP or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Dwarf, Stone, and Steel book that was originally written by Alfred Nunez, and I also went back to check all of the Dwarf Army books back to the 4th edition Dwarf Army book, which was printed in 1996, which 3rd edition is like basically unrecognizable. But 4th edition onwards, like that's dwarfs as long as dwarfs have been dwarfing. All of those versions of the story say that the High King of the Dwarves goes to help. that he personally goes to fight at the Battle of the Gates of Kislev. And it always has High King Alricsson participating in the battle. This is a critical part of the tale, as High King Alricsson shows his character by ignoring the advice and the choices of all of the other dwarf holds, because all of the other dwarf holds, when the Great War starts kicking off, they choose to seal their holds. They do what they did during the Cataclysm. They seal their holds and they wait for things to kind of blow over and calm down. But High King Alricsson doesn't. He instead chooses to honor the oath that High King Kurgan Ironbeard made with Sigmar Heldenhammer, and goes to fight. He goes to help the nations of men, which is actually kind of funny because he technically goes to Kislev, which wouldn't be covered under that oath technically, but whatever. Like, he honors the dwarf's relationship with humanity, which is a big part of Alricsson's personal story. And is a really awesome thing that showcases his character. He leads this small but elite army to go to the Battle of the Gates of Kislev. Now, you may wonder, well, okay, what's the big deal? Like, what does it really matter if High King Alricsson goes with Thorgrim? Because Thorgrim does go to the Battle of the Gates of Kislev in every version of the story. He was there, but he was a prince serving at High King Alricsson's side, as opposed to being the leader of the army. So, does it really matter if High King Alricsson was there or not? Well, in my opinion, yes, and I'll tell you why. In the 8th edition Army Book of the Dwarfs, we get a beautiful story of how exactly the dwarfs part of the Battle of the Gates of Kislev goes down. And it might be in some older books, but 8th edition is the one I really keenly remember it from. So High King Alricsson fights very nobly, and he performs so well that he's awarded essentially a Medal of Valor by the soon-to-be Emperor Magnus and Tsar Alexei. If I recall, that part is actually stated in some of the older Empire books as well. However, during the fighting, High King Alricsson is dealt a mortal wound by some terrible foe or greater demon or whatever, and he realizes that he's dying. So he returns to Karasakarak and calls on all of the clans across the Karazhan quarter to come visit him, because he has a great proclamation. Since he has no heir, because his sons or his children died either due to greenskin shenanigans or at the Battle of the Gates of Kislev, he makes a decision and declares that any who wish to be considered for the position of High King, as long as they have the requisites, they're royal, will have 1 year, one full calendar year, to accomplish the mightiest deeds they are capable of. And upon the end of that year, each contender will present their accomplishments before the High King and a council of elder longbeards. This leads to a storyline of Ungrim Ironfist, Budigar Angrind, who is the father of Belagar Ironhammer, and Thorgrim Grudgebearer all competing to be declared the next High King, with Thorgrim going on to accomplish some absolutely awesome feats to win the contest. During this entire ordeal, High King Alricsson is stubbornly refusing to die to his mortal wound that will not heal. When at last a successor is chosen in Thorgrim, Alricsson has fulfilled his oath of kingship and is able to finally close his eyes, passing away pretty much immediately. That's a great story that tells a lot about the character of Balin Alricsson and Thorgrim, not to mention Ungrim and Budigar, who have their own accomplishments. This is completely thrown in the trash by the 4th edition Dwarf Player's Handbook, replaced with a simple note of Alricsson just sitting in Karazakarak, and gives no explanation of what happens to him or how Thorgrim became High King. Instead, the book very, in my opinion, irritatedly, seems to just imply that Thorgrim becomes High King because he's Alricsson's son. So Alricsson kicks the bucket, and they're like, oh, Thorgrim, you're his son? All right, you're High King now. So he didn't earn it. He didn't do anything to deserve it. He just gets it because of who his dad is. And that's not true. That's just not how Thorgrim's story goes. Thorgrim earns the position of High King. He's not given it just due to like royal lineage. So I'm not a fan of that. Not a fan of that at all. Now, admittedly, it is possible that Games Workshop are behind this last lore change. Perhaps Games Workshop told Cubicle 7 that this is the new old world lore. That in the old world, when we eventually get to the Battle at the Gates of Kislev, High King Alricsson will indeed just stay home during the grand finale. That is the Battle at the Gates of Kislev. He's just going to sit back at home and he's going to send Thorgrim off by himself, leading 1,000 dwarfs to the Gates of Kislev. However, I honestly and very deeply personally doubt this is the case. As if Games Workshop had actually been deeply fact-checking the lore of this book, they should have caught numerous other issues in the book and just didn't. Like the whole like Thorgrim being his son bit and some other parts I'll talk about later. So I'll be a little blunt here that what I suspect may have happened is that whoever wrote this portion of the book just isn't a fan of the 8th edition Dwarf Armies book and just didn't include it. Like they either didn't read the book, or if they did read the book, they didn't like it and they decided to leave those parts out and they changed the lore. Which you may go, well, that's ridiculous. And I'll say, yeah, it sounds a little ridiculous, but that's legitimately what happens sometimes with these books. I've had the privilege to chat with a lot of the different authors who are all wonderful people. I'm genuinely not slandering anyone. I'm not like pointing at anyone. I'm not saying that Alfred did this or anyone in particular. But, you know, when they're writing, they only have so much space to write with. And so a lot of stuff has to get cut or squished and whatever to try and like make sure that you get within the appropriate word count and that it fits within the number of pages you're allowed. But there's a lot that goes into it. And because of that, you usually have one or two individuals who are writing up these sections and they are having to make cuts or make decisions on what to cut, what to like abbreviate and stuff like that. And sometimes you'll get someone that just doesn't like the more modern lore. That has happened numerous times throughout these books already. Like I have found stuff that has been written in the books that flies in the face of the lore and just doesn't work with Warhammer lore. Like the best example I can give is that in the Lustria book, one of the authors deliberately went in and wrote a vampire elf. Like he just made vampire elves canon. He was like, yep, vampire elf. And I literally did a string where I said, nope, that's not a thing. That's not supposed to be a thing. We do not have vampire elves in Warhammer. This opens up a huge can of worms. This is like a massive issue. That should not be a thing. And Cubicle 7 apparently agreed because they went in and edited the section and got rid of it. So there are authors deliberately making choices to try to change the lore to things that they prefer. Which, I mean, that's fine. If I was writing this, I would be doing the same thing of like, oh, I'm going to try and tell the story this way, or I'm going to try and do it this way. And yeah. But I would say in this case, this is a situation where no, this is a bad decision. This is a bad change. This is lessening the story. This is taking away character development. This is a bad take. And should be fixed. I beg of you, Cubicle 7. Please fix the Alricsson and Thorgrim storyline revolving around the Great War. And I just want to reiterate, between the issue of completely goofing on saying Thorgrim is Alricsson's son, which he 100 billion% absolutely beyond the shadow of the faintest doubt isn't. But then, of course, the issues of Alricsson losing his only major story beat as a tragic hero of the Great War, because outside of the Great War, Alricsson never does anything. Like, he is a nothing burger king that doesn't have any stories written about him. The Great War is his story. So removing him from the Great War completely obliterates what value he has as a character. And then, of course, also because of this Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition Player's Handbook version of the story, there is no explanation on how Thorgrim ascends to the throne. when he ascends to the throne or how he ascends to the throne. So this page, what is it, 13, is a big ol' issue. Please fix. Please fix. All right. From there, on to page 14, we have the fairly brief timeline for the dwarfs. And it's fine, but there's one error on it that's really weird and just needs to be fixed. It says on the year 2518 of the dwarf calendar, which is minus 1676 of the imperial calendar, there's a note that High King Alric dies at the Battle of Black Falls. This is 100% wrong. Massively wrong. Huge error. High King Alric, who is the father of Baron Alexson, dies at the Battle of Black Falls in 2205 of the Imperial calendar against Gorkill Eye Gouger. In literally every single book I have been able to find, so the 4th edition Dwarf Army book up to 8th edition, and I believe even the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition Stone and Steel book, they all say High King Alric dies in 2205. I have no idea how the Dwarf Player's Handbook screwed up the date to such a crazy extent. I don't know where they got minus 1676 from of the Imperial calendar. I even looked through all of the other dwarf timelines and nothing even happens on negative 1676. Nothing. So it's not like there was a timeline event and they accidentally put the wrong description. I couldn't find anything. There's nothing written for 1676. So I have no idea how that snuck in there. But that should be fixed. So please fix the timeline. As High King Alricsson should die at the Battle of Blackwater in 2205, because otherwise this would mean that High King Alric was sitting on the throne for 4,000 years. Or no, High King Alricsson, his son, would have been sitting on the throne for 4,000 years, which is not correct. That's, even by elf standards, that's a very long time. And by dwarf standards, that is impossible. So yeah, please fix that timeline note there. I mean, feel free to put something cool in minus 1676. If you got the year on there, I don't know, you could put something cool there. But yeah, I don't know why that's there. And even further, and I'll include a picture up, it's such a weird spot on the timeline because it even breaks up the timeline where it's supposed to be going in chronological order from top to bottom, right? It's supposed to be going from the higher up you are on the page, the further back it is, but it goes minus 2000 of the Imperial calendar to 1676 of the Imperial calendar, and then it jumps back to negative 1997 of the Imperial calendar. I don't know how this wasn't caught in editing, because it's a super blatant mistake where it screws up how the timeline is designed, because you go moving in chronological order. Haha, just kidding. Okay, moving back in chronological order. It's very weird. So please fix the timeline so it looks nice and cool and awesome and great. Now, I'm quite happy to say we don't have any other major issues outside the odd spelling or grammar oopsie until page 89, when shit hits the gyrocopter again. This one is particularly egregious, as I don't even have to defend it by turning to other army books and all that stuff. Because when it comes to the High King Alricsson stuff, technically you could argue against what I said by saying, oh, well, Sotek, that's just all of the army book lore. That is just retconned. And I would say I heavily disagree. I think it's an error, but that is an argument you can make against it. This one, though, no. You cannot argue against this. This is a big fat mistake that once again shows kind of a concerning editing process on this book. Because the book itself, I can use the Dwarf Player's Handbook to prove that the Dwarf Player's Handbook is wrong. So according to page 89 under the Gromril section, the legendary star metal known as Gromril wasn't discovered at all The dwarves had no knowledge of it. It was an unknown, mysterious metal until it was found around Kadak Varn in 657 of the Imperial calendar. So, not only does this passage, which is supposed to explain the basics of what is Gromril, not only does it fail to explain that it is a star metal, which is the most important thing about Gromril. Like, that is, period, the most important thing about Gromril as a metal, is that it is a star metal. It originates from the stars. It came down from somewhere else. And the reason that's super important is because it's very heavily implied that the old ones' technology, like the polar gates and their starships and stuff, is Gromril. Like, when the cataclysm happened and all their stuff blew up and got torn to pieces and stuff, it rained down on the planet, and that was Gromril. That the earliest Gromril, which we'll talk about in a minute, was stuff the old ones gave to the ancestor gods, which is a really, really cool storyline. Like, that's a fun little note you should hint at. But this book doesn't do that. It treats it as a weird metal that just got found in the ground 2,000 years ago. So anyway, but that date and all the information in these paragraphs is so wrong, it's not even funny. It's just utterly wrong. Wrong. So how do I know this? Well, beyond my Loremaster wisdom, I simply have to turn to a different page in the book. If you go to page 95 and read the section on the Anvils of Doom, where it talks about that the Anvils of Doom were forged in ancient times during the Golden Age, which was thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And what are Anvils of Doom made out of? Well, let's see. To quote, hammering doom runes upon its Gromril surface. Or maybe on page 121, where it says, quote, using the energy of the volcano's heart to forge the rare metal Gromril into shape. Well, wait! How are the Anvils of Doom made of Gromril when, according to the Gromril section on page 89, it literally says the only natural source of Gromril in the entire world is at Kadak Varn, which has a big vein of the stuff only discovered roughly 2,000 years ago, in 657 years after the Empire was founded. Why does it say that? Because the authors goofed up, which once again, I'm not saying this to harass anyone. I'm not saying this to like witch burn. I don't want anyone, nobody should harass any of the authors. No one should like get angry or any of that stuff. But I'm trying to point out that there were some pretty obvious and easy to catch mistakes made in this book that should not have been made, and that hopefully can and should be fixed. Now, are you not convinced? Because I've got even more. Because if we turn to page 138 and we check out the Ancestor God Smednir section, what's he up to? What is this Ancestor God famous for? The Ancestor Gods, in case you don't know, walked the world before the Cataclysm. So before chaos even existed in the world. And they were around during the Cataclysm. But they completely all vanished from the face of the earth after it was over. They retreated mysteriously. So, you know, they're pretty ancient beyond the memory of the dwarves. Well, it says, to quote, Smednir also developed and taught the skills of effectively refining and working with Gromril, the hardest metal in the world. So, the Gromril section on page 89 is just completely, utterly wrong in every way, just like the Great War Against Kislev section is. Gromril was discovered by the Ancestor Gods, which Kadak Varn hadn't even been established as a hold yet. So not only is Gromril much, much older, but it is also found in far more places than Kadak Varn. Now, Does Karakvarn have the largest vein discovered by the dwarfs in the last couple thousand years? Yes. Is it a very important source of Gromril that they need to get access to, but there's a whole lot of Skaven and nasty monsters in the flooded, horrible waters of the Blackwater, which flooded down to Karakvarn during the entry to the Goblin Wars? Yes. Is it something that should have like a sidebar of like Gromril in the modern age and have like an adventure hook of like you and your brave companions can try and be the dwarves that will continue the work of I think it was Kadrin Redbane, who was the runesmith that not only discovered that vein of Gromril, but also was mining it for a while before he was eventually killed by Skaven. Are those all things that should be in the book? Yes. But the page 89 section completely butchers the lore of Gromril and is just flat out lies. Like, it's not even like, oh, this is like easily salvageable. It has to be rewritten. Like, it's completely wrong. Super duper far off. So that wraps up, genuinely, my issues with the Dwarf Player's Guide. And despite the fact that don't mistake the way I'm speaking, because I know it could be mistaken this way. Don't mistake what I'm saying as like anger or rage or being upset or being like, indignant. No. I'm passionate. I want to make that really, really clear. I'm really passionate about these books because they're so good. The authors did such a good job, and these books are really fun. They're fascinating. They have so many great ideas. I've been kind of bitching for almost 45 minutes. But here's the thing. Out of 144 pages of the Dwarf's Player Guide, I only really have bones to pick with 4 of those pages. So there's roughly 140 pages-ish that I'm like, great, awesome. Like, are there things if I was writing it, which I'm not a great writer, so, take my opinion with a massive amount of salt. But, if I were writing it, are there some choices that I would have made differently? Yeah, absolutely. But I didn't write it. So, whatever. But those 4 pages got to get fixed. And even then, of those 4 pages, only 2 of them are like huge problems. Like the timeline thing, it's very blatantly a mistake because of the way that it like fucks up the chronological order of the timeline. And it's also the date's just completely wrong. And you can look at that and go, well, that doesn't make sense. That looks weird. And yeah, because it's an error. So that should just be fixed. But, it's like, whatever. That's just a little thing. But the page about the Great War Against Chaos, which I think was like page 13. And then the Gromril section on page 89. Those 2 have got to get rewritten. And I realize that's a huge pain in the ass because those aren't like, oh, we could just like change some words and they work. Like, no, they need to be like rewritten. Which I'm sure is a giant pain. But I am begging you guys to rewrite those sections because those sections are a mess. Now, I do want to take a moment to focus on the positives of this book. And granted, this is not my full review. I'm going to wait until I have a physical copy in my hands before I give a full review, because that's like a finished version of the book. It's still technically in early access. Focus on the positives for a moment. This book is absolutely bursting with incredible goodies about the dwarves, covering stories and concepts to bring together over 25 years, a quarter of a century of dwarf lore and development. The expanded priest careers to play dwarfs that follow the examples of the ancestor gods are insanely fun and make me very, very happy, along with all of the other careers they include in this book. It's a great book. There's tons of excellent notes in the timeline section to expand the dwarfs' impact on the world globally, as we get notes of things like the dwarfs discovering black powder before Grand Cathay did back in minus 420 of the imperial calendar and other such treats. We get things like how the book increases the tension between the various dwarfen realms to make things more interesting and dynamic, where the Grey Mountain dwarves have kind of issues with the Karasakara or the Karazankor dwarves, who have kind of issues with the Norscan dwarves, who have kind of issues with the Imperial dwarfs. Like, it's complicated and messy, and it's great. That's awesome. That's excellent, super fun stuff that gives players and GMs a lot of awesome ideas for their various campaigns and character building. I honest to God, honestly, really recommend buying this book if you're a Dwarf fan and want to enjoy the lore and or the roleplay game, which is fantastic. Now, do I wish that the authors that have been rather prevalent, I'm not naming names because I don't know who wrote what, but there has definitely been some choices in the Dwarf Player's Hand Guide and the High Elf Player's Hand Guide, which kind of tastes the same. Like there's somebody that seems to really hate the modern lore or just really doesn't like to use it and instead seems to rely on much older stuff, which I'm not a fan of. But that in and of itself is not damning. I'm more just looking out for things that just don't make sense. And like you look at it and you go, yep, nope, that's screwball. So I really hope that these can get fixed. The Dwarf Player's Handbook, it's really awesome. There are probably things you're going to want to homebrew to alter some of the rules a tad, but like show me a roleplay game that doesn't need some homebrewing to really make it fun for you and your party, and I'll call you a liar because every book has issues. I really hope this video can allow these errors and issues to be addressed so that the Dwarf Player's Guide can stand tall and proud as a fine addition to the long history of Warhammer Fantasy lore and literature, instead of being a mostly good attempt with some really painful flaws. I'll be back very soon with a similar video on the High Elf Player's Guide, which is so good until it very suddenly takes an absolute death spiral into abject insanity. I will be including links down below where you can submit polite and courteous, I'm going to repeat that, where you can submit polite and courteous feedback yourselves to Cubicle 7 to help me hopefully convince them that these changes should be implemented because they're important. And they will make for a better setting and for a better overall smooth ride through the lore that is Warhammer Fantasy. If you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. If you happen to know anyone over at Cubicle 7, please do show them this video or talk to them about it. I really would like to see this hopefully get somewhere. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. And Kazukan Kazukit Ha!